Now the David, spelled d4vd case is officially going to trial. Over the last few days, we finally got our first look at the case prosecutors have been building against David Burke. We heard about the blood discovered inside his garage, the blue plastic reportedly found embedded in Celeste's remains, and the supplies prosecutors say David purchased shortly after she disappeared, including chainsaws, a body bag, a shovel, and an inflatable pool. We also heard the medical examiner classify Celeste's death as a homicide caused by multiple penetrating injuries, while acknowledging that decomposition made it impossible to answer exactly when she died, how long she survived, or who was holding the object that killed her. And then came the messages. The court heard about Celeste becoming pregnant at 13, having an abortion, and later expressing anger and regret over what happened. And we also saw how that, quote-unquote relationship allegedly continued in secret, and how during the final hours before her death, Celeste threatened to expose David and destroy his career. And all this was presented during a 5-day preliminary hearing. It was not a trial, it was a preliminary hearing. Not to determine whether David was guilty or not, but to decide whether prosecutors had enough evidence to place the case in front of a jury. And the judge has now decided that they do. So David has officially been ordered to stand trial on the charges of murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. The judge ruled that prosecutors met their burden on every count and ordered him to remain jailed without bail. So for the first time, this case is moving beyond the question of whether there is enough evidence to continue. And at trial, prosecutors will have to prove that David killed Celeste, dismembered her body, and left her remains inside the front trunk of his Tesla because he feared the, quote-unquote relationship would destroy his career. And David's defense will have to confront all of this, not just individual weaknesses in the evidence, but the full story prosecutors say those pieces create. And during this preliminary hearing, we saw 12 witnesses being called. However, the district attorney's office actually said that these 12 witnesses is actually a very small portion of the evidence investigators have collected. So there's going to be even more witnesses, meaning some of the most important information in this case still has not been revealed to the public. David is scheduled to return to court on August 31st for his post-preliminary arraignment, but that is not his trial date. That's only the arraignment. So after everything we've learned over the last few days, one thing is now official. David is most definitely cooked. I mean, he's going to have to answer these allegations in front of a jury. And not only that, he's going to be in front of the whole world being told exactly everything that he did, or let's just say allegedly did, to Celeste. Now let's talk about a few things here. So the fact that David is actually going to trial is extremely significant because there was always a possibility that the judge could decide prosecutors simply had not shown enough evidence to move forward with the case. But in this situation, that was nowhere near what happened. Over 5 days, lead prosecutor Beth Silverman and her team carefully walked the judge through the entire timeline, from David's alleged relationship with Celeste to the final time she was seen entering his home, and then everything prosecutors say happened afterward. They presented the messages, photographs of them together, videos, witness testimony, and forensic evidence piece by piece, until the judge ultimately decided that there was probable cause on every charge. And according to District Attorney Nathan Hochman, what we heard during the preliminary hearing,
there was additional evidence that was actually considered in this case that we anticipate being presented at trial. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that additional evidence, only to say that we presented a significant but small fraction of our evidence in this preliminary hearing.
This was a very small fraction of the evidence the prosecutors say that they have. And I think that is the biggest takeaway, because everything we've discussed over the last few days, the messages, the blood evidence, the purchases, the Tesla, and the condition in which Celeste was found, was just a very small preview of the case they plan to present at trial. And that should tell us a lot. However, unlike a preliminary hearing, at trial, the standard is obviously going to be much higher. They will have to take all the evidence that they say that they have, place it in front of 12 jurors, and convince all 12 jurors unanimously that every element of the charges has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And the district attorney made it very clear that his office believes it'll be ready whenever that trial begins. Now, as far as when the actual trial is going to happen, there's no confirmed trial date yet. After his arraignment on August 31st, the court is going to begin setting the actual trial date then. So that's around a month, right? Now here's the interesting part. The trial could actually be set as early as 60 days later if David's defense continues demanding that everything move quickly. But that doesn't mean that the trial is officially beginning 60 days after August 31st. It only means that legally it could be scheduled that soon. And prosecutors are publicly saying that they will be ready whenever the defense wants to go, right? So that should tell you a lot about their confidence in the case that they have. Now, interestingly enough, right, David's own legal team reportedly wanted this process to move very quickly, especially initially when he got arrested. And I just want you guys to remember, if you go back to September 2025, when Celeste's decomposed and dismembered remains were discovered inside a Tesla registered to David, David was not arrested for all that time between September and April 2026. So for months, he was still a free man. And as a matter of fact, some of his Los Angeles neighbors even told reporters that before his arrest, David had been staying inside his property and just partying it up. So while investigators were quietly building this case behind the scenes, David was apparently still living his life, I guess unaware of just how close everything was getting. And then now months later, here we are. And also another aspect, and we're going to make another video on this, but it's actually now been confirmed that the district attorney's office are now considering whether to seek the death penalty, although that decision has not been made yet. But now that we're here, I would not really call this a win just yet. And the reason why I would say that is because prosecutors have only cleared the first major hurdle. Because during this trial, they have to show that David is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt on every element of these charges. So I don't really want to celebrate too much right now. Because also we have to remember that David's defense did not present its own evidence during this hearing. They challenged the prosecution's case and raised several arguments. But the district attorney acknowledged that the defense was not required to reveal everything it may eventually present. So while the case clearly looks bad, especially considering everything that they say they have, the real fight has not started yet. So we're going to see during the trial if this whole case holds up beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the most important thing. So I just don't really want to get ahead of myself too much. But with that being said, based on everything we have seen so far, prosecutors appear to have serious amount of evidence against David. And one question that still hasn't been answered fully is what surveillance evidence may exist from outside the house, the surrounding neighborhood, or David's movements afterward. We know that prosecutors say Celeste arrived at his Hollywood Hills home on April 23rd, 2025, and was never seen alive again. So when this case eventually goes to trial, the biggest question is going to be, in what type of surveillance footage can David be seen? And what story does that tell us? Because keep in mind that every category of evidence tells a different part of the same story. We have the messages showing David and Celeste's relationship and their communication leading up to her disappearance. We have the online purchases prosecutors connected to what allegedly happened afterward. We have the blood and DNA evidence from the garage. We have the Tesla's location history and the fact that Celeste's remains were ultimately discovered inside that vehicle. And then we have the medical evidence, which tells us what happened to her body, while also leaving major questions about the exact timing and sequence of her death. So now they're going to have to take all those separate pieces and prove that they lead back to David. In my opinion, the most telling part about this case is the communication between David and Celeste, because that is where prosecutors believe we can see the motive beginning to form. The night before Celeste arrived at David's home in the Hollywood Hills and was never seen alive again, she allegedly sent David a message threatening to end his career and ruin his life. Then the following day, they say that she went to his home and was never seen alive again. So when you place that message beside the timeline, the prosecution's theory becomes very clear. They believe that Celeste had become a threat to everything David had built, and that he killed her before she could expose their so-called relationship. Now that motive still has to be proven at trial, but the messages do more than simply show that David and Celeste knew each other. They give them basically a way to explain why they believe the murder happened when it did. And that's why the communication may become one of the most important parts of the entire trial. Now the question is, how is David even gonna explain any of this stuff? How does he explain Celeste threatening to expose him, arriving at his home the following day, and then never being seen alive again? How does he explain the purchases, the blood evidence, and her remains eventually being found inside a vehicle registered to him? That is going to be extremely difficult to defend. Because here's the thing, David's legal team, his defense, they don't necessarily have to prove exactly what happened, but they do have to create enough doubt to question the prosecution's version of events. And so when every separate piece of evidence appears to point in the same direction, that becomes a very difficult story to break apart. And there's another part of the communication that may even be more difficult for David's defense to explain, because keep in mind, they reconstructed an entire timeline of what happened before, during, and after. And according to the timeline presented in court, David arranged an Uber to bring Celeste from Lake Elsinore, where she was from, all the way to his home in the Hollywood Hills. As she was getting close to his house, Celeste sent David what would become her final known text message. She told him that she was almost there and asked him to open the door if he was home. And after Celeste reached that property, her phone went completely silent. No more messages, no more communication, and according to prosecutors, she was never seen alive again. So that creates a very specific window of time that David's defense will eventually have to address. What happened after Celeste reached his door? And how come she arrived and then never left the house? And what exactly happened when she was inside? And if David was not responsible for her death, how did her remains eventually end up inside the front trunk of the Tesla registered to him? I mean, you don't really have to be a prosecutor to question everything that happened here, okay, in the story. So those are the type of questions that makes this case so difficult to look at. And that's why it's so difficult for anybody to look at this case and treat all these events as random coincidences. So yeah, when we say that David is cooked, he is cooked, okay? So as disturbing as the last few days were, we still only know a very small part of what really happened. And you know what the biggest thing this entire story has reminded me of is that evil can exist much closer to us than we realize. You have to remember, David was not some completely unknown person operating in the shadows. He was a successful artist with millions of listeners, millions of young fans just like Celeste, a growing career and an enormous spotlight on him. He appeared publicly, released music, and continued living his life while carrying a secret this horrifying behind the scenes, allegedly. And obviously these allegations still have to be proven at trial, but if the prosecution's version of events is true, it shows you that fame, talent, and success do not automatically tell you anything about who someone truly is when nobody's watching. The thing is, sometimes we assume that the most dangerous people will be easy to recognize. We imagine that evil always looks obvious, that there will be warning signs everyone can see. But sometimes it can exist behind a familiar face, a successful career, and a life that appears completely normal from the outside. And that is what makes stories like this so disturbing, because it forces you to ask, how well do we even know the people around us? And how much darkness can remain hidden until something finally brings it into the light? So yes, David is absolutely cooked, and now he is going to have to face these allegations at trial. But beyond David, Celeste represents so many children who were not protected when they should have been. Children who were manipulated, ignored, placed in situations they never had the maturity or power to fully understand. And that is why this story is so much bigger than just the fame aspect or David himself or the music or the headlines surrounding this case. At the center of everything was a 14-year-old girl who deserves to be protected. She deserved the opportunity to grow up, discover who she was, and live an entire life beyond the circumstances she had been pulled into. Instead, her name is now connected to one of the most disturbing cases we have ever covered on this channel and probably music history. I mean, honestly, I don't know anything that's darker than this. So while the trial will eventually decide whether David is legally responsible, I just hope that throughout this process, people never lose sight of who this story is actually about. Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Rest in peace.